Now see if you can share these words with me. I'll switch where I can read a little better. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitled them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Those words real familiar yet? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The opening words of the U.S. Declaration of Independence. So go back just a little bit into American history, and why is it that America declared independence?
They wanted freedom of church.
Freedom of religion.
Yeah.
Okay, that was one reason.
Less government control.
Less government control. Okay.
We don't have today.
Taxation without representation. All of these things are part and bound up with the idea that all men are created equal, and they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. That people, God created to grow into maturity so that they are capable of self-government, self-discipline, not to be slaves underneath a few people who make all the laws and declare what they should and should not do. And if you go back into Europe at that time, there was a few nobility that held all the power. The common people couldn't even go hunting because it was only on the private lands of the Lord where any wildlife was to be found. And yet, America, where there was boundless lands, every person had a gun and knew how to use it. Unless they lived in a very isolated village, because how else were they going to survive? And those people who had that independent spirit, that we know that God has given us the ability to live, to make our way in this world, and that we are therefore, there are some rights that God embedded in the identity of people. And it's only when government comes and imposes something over that and creates injustice in the system that those rights become suppressed and people fail to live up to those expectations that are inborn that God put into them. So, 200-something years later, we're moving in a cycle. And we have many people in our country that think it's better to pass laws that tell everyone down to what size drink you can order, because they're not capable of making that choice rationally for themselves. Well, that's only going to be the case if there is some systematic oppression and injustice going on, so that people are not growing to maturity or suffering the consequences of foolish decisions. Divine rights. Now, if you were paying attention in social studies class and you heard divine right, what would you think of? What was that did apply to?
Constitution.
It applied only to the king, and it said, he's basically saying, I'm the king because God made me the king. And therefore, since God made me the king, I can do what I want to do. It's my responsibility. It's your responsibility to obey. And the whole Enlightenment period that culminated in the Declaration of Independence and the founding of America as an independent country was a rejection of this autocratic system where it's saying, no, the king is subject to a law beyond himself. And if the king is not subjecting himself to that law, then the people need to replace him. And therefore, the words of our Constitution, we the people, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, to provide for the common welfare, all those things that they say, is saying that can't take place in this unjust system. So we're going to make a new system. But where did our founding fathers get these ideas? Are they even right? Where did they form these ideas that there are certain rights that are embedded in the creation of man and that no government should be able to take them away? Where did they get these ideas?
Good question.
We've had one say the Bible. All this goes into looking back into where God first called out a nation, and God took a direct hand in forming the government over a people who had been slaves. They had no rights, and they hadn't done any thinking about, well, what's the best form of government? Any form of government can be good or bad, depending on the people running it. But God had this direct say in how the Jewish people were going to be governed and what laws were going to govern them when they came out of Egypt. That's where we want to go, because in those laws where he talks about this is the right way to treat people, this is the way to find out what really happened, and if you can't tell, then you're going to do this other thing, so that God reveals what is just. And then we're going to jump a little bit later into the New Testament where there's some disagreements, because isn't all law coming down to one party versus another disagreeing over what's the right thing to do? And so even if you have an agreement, a business deal, and somebody kind of falls down on the job and they take it to court, to the judge to decide what's going to happen. Well, Paul wrote to the church in Corinth because they were taking their Christian brothers and sisters to court. And Paul's saying, are you crazy? God is going to put us in charge of judging angels. You should know enough about what is right and wrong to be able to make this decision amongst yourselves, instead of going and bearing bad witness to the world, saying Christians don't even know how to get along with each other. And then what those messages about in the Old Testament about what is justice and these principles that are the undergirding of all the laws that caused America to become the great nation that it was. Those foundations, and then what Paul says, we're going to take those and just ask some questions of what does that mean for where we are now in our world. Got a map where we're going?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, Leviticus chapter 19. Whew. Anybody just really enjoying reading Leviticus? It's kind of heavy going. We're going to try to lighten this a little bit and go. I'm not as skilled with the humor as Blake, so just y'all bear with me, and if we need to, I'm sure Tim will come up with a wisecrack for us at the right time. Okay? I'm counting on you, brother. So we're going to start in verse 15. We're just going to read this, and then we're going to have some observations over these verses here before we jump back into Exodus. Do not twist justice in legal matters by favoring the poor or being partial to the rich and powerful. Always judge people fairly. So, in the forms of government that we see in recent history, we've got some where the rich and powerful always get their way, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they can buy the best attorneys and they know all the loopholes to hire the best accountants and to get the lowest taxes and everything else. So in that system of government, the rich and powerful are going to hold sway. But we also have a lot of political streams that, there's a man whose name starts with M and ends with X and has R in the middle. Well, there's a lot of that where it's more, no, you're going to deliberately force these people to pay more to really pull it out of their hide to support this working class. Well, is either extreme correct? Is either extreme going to create a balanced, whole, holy society with justice? So, here we are, the very first verse. Don't twist justice in legal matters by favoring one side or the other. Be fair. Stand up in the presence of the elderly and show respect for the aged. Fear your God, I am the Lord. Wait a minute, wait. This is the same importance? What? How is this part of justice? How is this part of a legal system? We'll get to that a little later. Do not take advantage of foreigners who live among you in your land. Treat them like native-born Israelites. Love them as you love yourself. Remember that you were once foreigners living in the land of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. Remember, hear that chorus, I am the Lord. You get your identity from me, and your identity determines how you act. Who is the Holy One of Israel? You shall be holy, for I am holy. Do not use dishonest standards when measuring length, weight, or volume, or any of the other ways that we measure things now. Your scales and weights must be accurate. Your containers for measuring dry materials or liquids must be accurate. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. This is quite a collection of things all bound together in just a few verses, right? Foundations of justice. So let's keep going into Exodus. And then we'll come back and kind of weave these things together. I don't know if you all can read this slide or not. It's kind of a bunch of verses there. Can you see them, Joe? Can you read them? Okay. Anyone who assaults and kills another person must be put to death. But if it was simply an accident permitted by God, I'll appoint a place of refuge where the slayer can run for safety. Because at that time in history, it was very much a revenge culture. And so all the family of the one who was killed were expected to take the revenge and kill the murderer. Well, if it's an accident, and how are you going to prove that until you have opportunity for a trial? So there were the cities of refuge on each side of the river that people could run to until the case was tried. However, if someone deliberately kills another person, then the slayer must be dragged even from my altar and be put to death. That's where people went. Say, oh, mercy, refuge. They went to the temple and hid in the altar. He said, drag them away. I'm not going to protect them. Anyone who strikes father or mother must be put to death. Oh, here we again, this second verse. We've got this thing about respect for the elders. Verse 16, kidnappers must be put to death, whether they're caught in possession of their victims or have already sold them as slaves. Anyone who dishonors father or mother must be put to death. Ooh, these were those scary verses when you were a kid, growing up, reading the Old Testament. We're not going to go into the specific story where the man was cursing his parents and they said, all right, God, what are we going to do with him? And he says, you're going to stone him. My parents like to read that story to us somehow. Now, suppose two men quarrel. One hits the other with a stone or fist, and the injured person does not die, but is confined to bed. If he's later able to walk outside again, even with a crutch, the assailant will not be punished, but must compensate his victim for lost wages and provide for his full recovery. Where does it say about exorbitant amounts for pain and suffering there? Now, suppose two men are fighting, and in the process they accidentally strike a pregnant woman so she gives birth prematurely. If no further injury results, the man who struck the woman must pay the amount of compensation the woman's husband demands and the judges approve. But if there is further injury, the punishment must match the injury. So you can't escalate it. This is a limiting clause. Life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. It's limiting it. You can't keep upping it. If a man hits his male or female slave in the eye and the eye is blinded, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the eye. If a man knocks the tooth out of his male or female slave, he must let the slave go free to compensate for the tooth. You're going to be more careful in disciplining a slave if you've got to let them go free and compensate them if you really harm them. Now, it doesn't directly address slavery, but it's creating a more just way for them to be treated compared to what was in the culture. He's raising the standard, raising the expectation. Then the next slide goes to the next verse. If an ox gores a man or woman to death, the ox must be stoned, and its flesh may not be eaten. In such case, however, the owner will not be held liable. But suppose the ox had a reputation for goring, and the owner had been informed but failed to keep it under control. If the ox then kills someone, it must be stoned, and the owner must also be put to death. That's pretty stout, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Your bull gets out, and you knew it had a problem of getting out and getting people, and you didn't do anything about it, you're going to die. So, would this be something similar if we had a case where you were informed that there was a dangerous situation that you were responsible to manage, whether it had to deal with fire hazard or building code safety or a tree in danger of falling, and if that happens, or dogs, wild. Justice. Consequences that match the action. However, the dead person's relatives may choose to accept payment to compensate for the loss of life. So it doesn't have to kill the man. They could just demand payment. The owner of the ox may redeem his life by paying whatever is demanded. The same regulation applies if the ox gores a boy or a girl. So he's elevating children again. But if the ox gores a slave, either male or female, the animal's owner must pay the slave's owner 30 silver coins, and the ox must be stoned to compensate for the value of that slave. That was the price. It's even elevating slaves over what was taking place in the rest of the world at that time. Suppose someone digs or uncovers a pit and fails to cover it, and then an ox or donkey falls into it. The The owner of the pit must pay full compensation to the owner of the animal, but then he gets to keep the dead animal. Okay? It's not punitive. It's just, this is the consequence. You did something that caused my animal to die. You got to pay me for the animal, but you can keep the dead one. You get some salvage. So, if somebody does something and wrecks my car, what would be the analogous thing? They got to pay for the value of my car, but then they get to keep the salvage. Would that be a good analogy? Mm-hmm. Okay. If someone's ox injures a neighbor's ox, so this is not a person, and the injured ox dies, then the two owners must sell the live ox and divide the price equally between them. They must also divide the dead animal. But if the ox had a reputation for goring, yet its owner failed to keep it under control, he must pay full compensation, a live ox for the dead one, but he can keep the dead ox. Do you like how this is? It's not overblown with, oh, we're going to punish them. It's just, all right, here's the consequence. It reminds me a good bit about this website and an organization of group that's about parenting. It's called Love and Logic. And one of the examples they have on the home page, and you can go to their webpage, it's loveandlogic.com. And it's all about this. You just apply the natural consequences to let the children learn from it. It's not punitive. So the child leaves their bike out on the street and it gets stolen. What does the parent say? I'm very sorry. I know you must be very upset that your bike was stolen. You chose to leave it out without locking it. So I'll help you find some ways to earn so that you can buy your next bike. Because I bought this one as a gift and you didn't take care of it. So you will buy the next one. Will that child learn the value and make those same mistakes? Not very likely. Although I know some that are a little slower to learn. But natural consequences are better teachers.
Yep.
And you can't make a law for everything, can you? No? So let's just, these verses in Exodus and those we looked at in Leviticus, just a little bit of conversation about them. Why does God put these things in there? Why does He include these things about respect for parents and respect for the elderly in the middle of these regulations about if one ox hurts another ox? What is this about in forming the philosophy behind good law?
Be fair.
It's respect.
Respect. Fair. Now, going back to these words we read about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Wait, all men are created equal? And God's saying in these verses you need to treat the foreigners the same as you're going to treat your fellow countrymen. And then He raises the status of slaves and of women and other things to say treat them more fairly, because in that culture, if you were a slave, it's because you showed yourself to be a worthless human. You couldn't even take care of yourself. You had to be under someone else's control for your own protection. Because if you were sold into slavery, it's because you didn't work enough for yourself. You didn't show the self-discipline to take care of yourself. Therefore, you had to become a slave. And of course, the biblical law is full of opportunities for slaves to regain their freedom. Every 7 years, the land would be left, and every 50th year, after the 7th Sabbath, all slaves that were to be released and to be given back their ancestral lands. So God provides plenty of opportunity for restoration. But he's even in that where people have fallen, he's providing a safety net, a protection to keep them from being treated as inhuman. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life,
liberty,
and
happiness.
But Thomas Jefferson changed that last phrase from what was the common discussion in that day. And it probably wasn't a very good change as far as the history of our country, because people have used it as an excuse for a lot of decadent things. Those words came from a pamphlet on good governance by John Locke, and his words was life, liberty, and property. So that people couldn't confiscate your property for their own purposes. But guess who, even back then, we had the lobby interests. Because Thomas Jefferson was a large landholder, and all the other large landholders were a little fearful about letting these common people have the same privilege about land and property as they had. An injustice just from the change of a phrase that has crept into our country's government and grown over time. So these laws are about respect for others, those who have lived and shown experience, and respect for those who have made their way successfully, yet protection for those who have made foolish choices. And to protect the rights of property. We could go into the passages about making sure you don't move the boundary stone, and those about passing the property on down through the generations, and the story in the book at the end of Joshua where one of the men who received an inheritance, but he died, and he didn't have any sons to pass it to, and the daughters, his name was Zelophehad, his daughters came and said, well, hey, there's no sons to inherit. Are this property just going to leave our family? Because women couldn't inherit it culturally at the time, and they inquire the Lord, and the Lord says, of course these women are going to inherit. This is their family's property. God provides the foundation to say this is what is good and just, so that you have the respect for other people, for their status as a creature made in God's image, and to respect their property and their decision making. That's the foundation of this law. So let's jump on over to what happens here. But before we get to 1 Corinthians 6, let's just go into the New Testament and see what the New Testament writers say was the purpose of the old law. Because we're not following the old law now, right? How many of you have offered your animal sacrifice this week? No?
No.
How many of you observed your kosher laws this week, clean and unclean? Now, I know Don had some bacon. And I did too. Some jalapeno poppers. Good stuff. We found out some friends in Tennessee call them firecrackers. So, anyway, Galatians chapter 3, Paul is talking because these people were trying to go back and say, oh, you know, to be a really good Christian, you're going to have to follow the law. And Paul's saying, God forbid. You're going to try to go back to that way that nobody could even live up to? It's the principles behind it. And so in Galatians chapter 3, verse 23, this is New Living Translation, but there's some others that will get in at different aspects of what he's saying, that the law was put in place before the way of faith. It was available, and we were placed under guard by the law. This is a protective custody. Somebody that doesn't really know better, you put them in protective custody so that they can't get out. Just like you put the good fence around the playground area so that that fence protects the children. It gives them greater freedom. You don't have to worry about them getting out into the street. So the law was this protective custody. We were kept in protective custody, so to speak, until the way of faith was revealed. Let me put it another way. The law was our guardian until Christ came. You may see in other translations, schoolmaster, tutor. Or if you go into the Message, then he'll even get in, because the word that's used is the pedagogue. It was the Greek slave for the family who went with the children to make sure they got to school and didn't get distracted or lost or attacked or any of the other things. It was the person who held their hand and got them where they needed to go and made sure they did their homework. The nanny. We don't need a nanny state anymore with maturity in Christ. So, it protected us until we could be made right with God through faith. And now that the way of faith has come, we no longer need the law as our guardian. Now, every parent knows you can't tell them everything that they shouldn't do. Right?
We can try.
We can try. But if we teach them principles of what is good and what is not, then, and they learn and take those in all the way to the heart, then they will be able, when they face situations that we never even dreamed about, make an informed choice, right? Mm-hmm. So, let's go on to 1 Corinthians 6. Starting in verse 1. When one of you has a dispute with another believer, how dare you file a lawsuit and ask a secular court to decide the matter instead of taking it to other believers? Don't you realize someday we believers will judge the world? Have we not learned enough of what is good and right to know what is wrong? And since you're going to judge the world, can't you decide even these little things among yourselves? Don't you realize we'll judge angels? So you should surely be able to resolve ordinary disputes in this life. If you have legal disputes about such matters, why go to outside judges who aren't respected by the church, who don't hold the same values of what is good and right? I'm saying this to shame you. Isn't there anyone in all the church wise enough to decide these issues? But instead, one believer sues another right in front of unbelievers. Even to have such lawsuits with one another is a defeat for you. Why not just accept the injustice and leave it at that? Why not let yourselves be cheated? Instead, you yourselves are the one who do wrong and cheat even your fellow believers. So remember, going back to what is this foundation of the law about respect and property, rights that are God-given, that God has put into our very identities as people made in His image. And that we have this inborn sense of right and wrong that we can train and develop, or we can twist and pervert. And our culture has a big role in doing that. And we as Christians have an opportunity to influence that, to stand witness for what is true. But we all know that there are plenty of people out there who they've got a lot to say about what is true and what is just and what should be done, but the way that they go about it completely undermines their witness. Somebody who says they're pro-life and then they go and bomb or murder to justify, how can that be right? Is the unborn child's life worth more than the doctor's life? If all men are created equal? We're running out of time, so let's get down to some of this about where the rubber meets the road. Christians should be at the forefront as champions for justice. and helping to define what justice is in a world that is just like it was in the time when the Jews came out of captivity. It was full of all kinds of oppression and injustices and twistings of what was good and right. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "Woe to those who call good evil, who put darkness for light, light for darkness, who switch up bitter and sweet and bitter." We've got all kind of things where we just change the labels on stuff and pretend that we've made good into evil. That's taking place in our world all around, in this country and in many others around the world. Yet Christians should be standing witness to what is the truth, what is right. But how do we do that? Well, could be like Lucy Hargis' daughter went and served as an attorney and helped with protecting where people were being exploited sexually, sold into slavery for that, or where children are being exploited. Friends of ours that the Hewitts know, we got to visit with him last Friday. He works with International Justice Mission in Rwanda, and the main work that they do there in Rwanda is help prosecute child abusers. And helping the Rwanda government understand how to do that, because before it was just swept under the rug. The government didn't know how to deal with it. They didn't know how to pursue justice in that kind of situation. We've talked to some others about how do we cultivate justice for immigrants or for people who want to be immigrants. How do we create justice, whether it's on this side of the border or on that side? How do we go about doing that? That's our responsibility as God's children, as those who are going to judge the world one day. The unborn, any victim group, we need to be at the forefront of helping. Now, of course, there are plenty of people that say, "Oh, I'm the victim." How do we go about building a world and providing support so that there is greater justice and that we advocate for those who are being oppressed? That's our responsibility. Respect for the elderly. Now, I know there's a lot of programs about food for hungry people and lots of other things. Did you know there are more elderly who die in the UK from lack of heat every winter than there are people who die in the US, a much bigger country, from hunger? But nobody seems to really care that much. There's no million-man march for that. And now, we see more stuff coming in about healthcare. Now, I know that we can't do everything, and you can't take heroic measures for everything. It's not people that are going to respect others are not going to demand heroic measures when they're at the end of their life and there isn't any hope of them really getting better, but just hanging on for a few more days. But are we really going to deny care just because someone has reached a certain age mark if they have a hope of getting better? That is on our doorstep right now. Are we going to show respect for the elderly? Or are we going to be like Solomon's son who just said, "Oh, I'm going to do what I want to do," and lost the kingdom as a result? Every day we are facing more difficult ethical questions brought about by technology. Genetically modified organisms, genetic testing, use of different human tissues, whether it's blood or organs or stem cells or genetic therapy, or they just abound more and more. How are we going to be at the front of saying, this is the way of God? This is the way that respects life, that respects dignity, that respects property? There are all these thorny questions about privacy. Anyone can say yes it's wrong for somebody with a super telephoto lens to be peeking in on somebody famous to get a picture of them in a compromising situation. Anybody can agree that's wrong, but where is the line? When you're overhearing someone's cell phone conversation, all these, we were talking with the kids, they were saying, well, when were cell phones invented? Well, it was after we were out of high school that anybody really had a cell phone. And then they had this big old bag that they had to carry. And so how do you determine what the proper etiquette is when some of these things take a while to work out? Christians need to be at the forefront, yet the way we go about it is just as important as what we say. Let's look at this next slide. This is the kind of world we live in. The number of choices we have to make are just multiplying exponentially. The number of questions about what is good, what is right, what is the best way. Are we going to make Main Street a human pedestrian mall or leave it open to traffic? What is the best thing? Everybody's got an opinion. How do we use these foundational principles of respect, property, making sure that we don't make a way that people can't make a living by the laws that we pass, the taxes we impose, the regulations? That's why a lot of companies have left the U.S. They've found a freer way of regulation. Now, it doesn't mean they're going a place for the right reason, but sometimes the tax burden or regulation burden does drive someone out of business. I'm having to close the organization in Rwanda because there are some really punitive things from their tax structure that's making it just about impossible to keep that organization going as a small business. We need to be there at the forefront, but it's a difficult thing. It's hard questions. It's not things that you can just dictate and say, this is the way. So let's look at this verse. This is one of many that we could look at on the subject, but this one just seems very appropriate. It's here at the very end of Paul's life. This is his final advice to Timothy, his son in the faith, who he is left to kind of provide guidance to all these different churches that he has planted. And this is advice he gives to Timothy. Run away from infantile indulgence. Run after mature righteousness, faith, love, peace, joining those who are honest and serious prayer before God, who are in honest and serious prayer, not just seeking their own way, not trying to justify what they want to do, but in honest and serious prayer. Refuse to get involved in inane discussions, because people will argue about anything. They always end up in fights. God's servant must not be argumentative, but a gentle listener and teacher who keeps cool, working firmly but patiently with those who refuse to obey. We can't make the laws for our country. We can't force everyone to accept our standards, but we can be a light. We can be a witness. You never know how or when God might sober them up with a change of heart and a turning to the truth, enabling them to escape the devil's trap where they are caught and held captive, forced to run his errands. We're almost at the end of this Holy Community series, even though we could probably have a different subject every week for the rest of the year. But we don't want to beat a dead horse. We're laying these principles to say, How is it that we as God's people represent His holiness in the world? How is it that we shine that light, that we represent that truth, that we represent that balanced way of living that is godly wisdom? How do we do that? How do we move forward? By faith. Just like we read in Galatians, it's not something that we can do on our power. It's something we had to do by faith and relying on the Spirit of God to bring conviction. Guys, you got a song for us? These words that Paul wrote to Timothy, or what he wrote in 1 Timothy 3 about always being ready to give an answer for the hope you have, the more there is darkness in the world, the more brightly those who are shining will appear. So, while I agree with Greg's prayer this morning that I'm very grateful for a country where we have freedom to assemble, to worship without fear, one day that may not be the truth. One day you may be somewhere else in the world and that will not be true there. But God doesn't call us to be that only when we don't fear, but to be that because we are His children, because we represent Him in this world. And He is seeking every person that He can turn and rescue from the enemy. Let's join Him. Let's pledge ourselves to that work.